Welcome, Dr. Corey, to UST. We really appreciate your visit and your time with us. As is customary during the Q&A, Dr. Hauser gets the last question, and it's a doozy. And so we're all here really to hear that. And one of the things is VPA and Dr. George Harn. Where are you, George? Our Dean of Arts and Sciences. We talk a lot about a great Catholic university, right? And in reflection on that, for today, I was reflecting on a statement in 2018 by the American Catholic Philosophical Association, and we find there, and I'm quoting, the university is premised on the idea that truth is one. The various disciplines cohere to form an intelligible whole. Specifically, Catholic universities are premised on the idea that the ultimate source of this unity is God, who is knowable not only by faith, but also by reason. The university in general, and the Catholic University in particular, call upon philosophy as a central source of integration. Now, certainly the ultimate source of unity for this intelligible whole is God, but specifically, it's the God of Jesus Christ, the true knowledge of whom continues to be found in the church. This added nuance could perhaps bring the identity of a university into clearer focus. The Catholic University is a place where philosophy is indeed a central source of integration, but it is also a place where that curriculum is inspired and illumined by the true knowledge of Jesus Christ. And that in turn requires faculty who are quickened in that faith and who are able to achieve that integration whenever possible. The Center for Thomistic Studies is truly one of UST's finest gems. It is a key ingredient that helps make UST Catholic, and its recognized excellence of academic achievement, specifically in bringing forth the wisdom of Thomas Aquinas, enabled us to be a great Catholic university. This academic excellence and the anchoring of that identity does not happen by chance. For this, strong leadership is needed, and this can be found in the current director, Dr. Brian Corll, and in past directors, Tom Osborne. Where are you, Tom? Give us a wave. There we go. Steve Jensen, and especially Mary Catherine Summers. There you go. And with that, let's all embarrass Brian as much as possible by giving a big round of applause.
Thank you, Dr. Evans, for the very kind introduction, for the very kind words about the center and our place here at the University of St. Thomas. I want to thank all of you for being here with us tonight. Good evening to all of you, to our students, our faculty, administrators, board members, guests, friends, and supporters of the Center for Thomistic Studies and of the university. As the director of the center, it is my privilege to welcome all of you to this year's Aquinas Lecture and to introduce this evening's lecturer. This is a year of major celebrations for the University of St. Thomas, as the university celebrates both its own 75th anniversary, as well as the 200th anniversary of the foundation of the Basilian Fathers. It was through the visionary work of the Basilian Father, Father Victor Brezik, that the Center for Thomistic Studies was founded here at the University of St. Thomas in 1980 as an academic center and as a graduate program in philosophy devoted to promoting the study of the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. The vision of the Center for Thomistic Studies has always been to promote a living Thomism, deeply grounded in the thought of St. Thomas and oriented towards a rigorous engagement with the questions of the 21st century. And since its foundation, one of the highlights of our work in the center each year is the opportunity to come together to host the Aquinas Lecture, where we have been blessed to hear from many of the most eminent scholars of Thomism of the past 40 years. And ever since the 25th anniversary of the center, we have also bestowed on each year's Aquinas lecturer a medal, inducting them into our Order of St. Thomas. The 42nd Aquinas lecturer will be Professor Therese Corey. Dr. Corey is the John and Jean Osterley Associate Professor of Thomistic Studies at the University of Notre Dame, where she has been a member of the faculty since 2015. A graduate of the School of Philosophy at the Catholic University of America, Dr. Corey was a fellow of the National Humanities Center in 2017, a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in 2016, and she has been an ordinary member of the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas Aquinas since 2019. Her scholarly work has received many significant honors, including the Founders Prize from the Society for Medieval and Renaissance Philosophy, the Veritas et Amor Prize for her book, Aquinas on Human Self-Knowledge, the annual prize for the best published article from the Journal of the History of Philosophy, and the Rising Scholar Award from the American Catholic Philosophical Quarterly. Dr. Corey's work has focused on medieval theories of cognition, mind, and personhood, with special focus on the thought of St. Thomas. A deeply insightful reader of St. Thomas, in light of his sources, Dr. Corey is one who exemplifies well for us the mission of our own Center for Thomistic Studies and our university's commitment to cultivating the Catholic intellectual tradition in service of the truth. As successful as her career has been, the study of philosophy is not for Dr. Corey merely a matter of professional interest or of a career. I remember a dinner at a conference a few years ago when someone from another university expressed surprise that Dr. Corey and some colleagues were still discussing Avicenna and St. Thomas's views about knowledge at 9 p.m. on a Saturday. I had to explain. Dr. Corey is in fact in this for the pursuit of truth. And then I had to excuse myself and get back to the conversation with Dr. Corey. For Dr. Corey, as for those of us blessed to work and study here at the University of St. Thomas, the study of philosophy is indeed inspired by the love of truth. We look to the thought of our university's patron, St. Thomas, as a guiding light, offering resources that can help us to think about the major questions of our own day. And it is in this spirit that we are honored to welcome Dr. Corey this evening. Dr. Corey's lecture tonight is entitled, "The Nature We Ought to Love, a Thomistic Perspective on the Moral Evils of Racism." Please help me to welcome our 42nd Aquinas lecturer, Professor Therese Corey.
Thank you, Brian, for that wonderfully generous introduction, and thank you all of you for being here tonight. It's a great honor to be here to celebrate the Feast of Aquinas with all of you, and in particular, to be here during the year of the 75th anniversary of the University of St. Thomas. The faculty at the Center for Thomistic Studies have been a part of my intellectual formation for as long as I can remember. This is my first time on campus, but many of them have taught me so many things over the years through various conferences and publications and mentoring. And I'm extremely grateful and just so happy to be here on site where it all happens at the Center for Thomistic Studies. Oops, I don't know if this works. Oh, yeah, okay. So in an Angelus address in 2008, Pope Benedict XVI urged Christian communities to help civil society overcome every possible temptation to give in to racism, intolerance, and exclusion, and to make decisions that respect the dignity of every human being. It is a task, he said, especially well suited to Christians who know the church as, quote, made up of people of every race and culture, called to be a hospitable home to all, a sign and instrument of communion for the whole human family. In 2020, in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis described racism as a virus infecting our capacity to love that makes members of our own society into, quote, existential foreigners in their own country. From the gospel of Jesus Christ, he wrote, there arises the primacy given to relationship, to the encounter with the sacred mystery of the other, to universal communion with the entire human family as a vocation of all. Since the murder of George Floyd in May of 2020, more people in America than ever are talking about racism. And yet, far from leading the way, as the popes have urged, many Catholics feel lost and alienated by the conversation. Some find popular discussions of racism thin or unsubstantial. I recently heard from a student who worried that diversity initiatives felt fake, a game played with mysterious buzzwords. There's fear of getting sucked into a guilt vortex from which there's no redemption, and great confusion around what racism is exactly in the first place. One would hope that the Catholic moral tradition should be able to offer some useful guidance here, and the first few steps down that road are easily taken. From discussion, some racist acts, such as enslavement or segregation or humiliation, practically beg to be analyzed in familiar moral categories. From discussions of murder, we know that acts that attack the basic dignity and rights of the person are wrong, always and everywhere, no matter the circumstances. But then there are those racial injustices woven into the fabric of everyday life, and it is not clear how to fit them into the usual moral categories. So skepticism arises. Can a social structure be racist? Can I be morally guilty for the functioning of a system that I did not build? Can someone be unintentionally racist? And the conversation often gets bogged down around those questions. It seems to me that something is missing. We should be in the forefront of the discussion, drawing on riches of the Catholic intellectual tradition in a thoughtful and intelligent way. But instead, we often find ourselves lacking the tools to even get the conversation going. In the face of this difficulty, I keep returning to Thomas Aquinas, whom we're honoring tonight in connection with his feast day tomorrow, and whom I like to call my work husband because we spend so much of the day together. My actual husband is a philosopher too, but even he gets jealous of Thomas Aquinas sometimes. Can Aquinas' moral thought help us have a better discussion about racism? And I think it can. So tonight I want to offer a very preliminary sketch of what a Thomistic analysis of the evils of racism could look like. Let me emphasize that I'm a philosopher, not a sociologist or a historian. And as Aquinas says, no one can give what he does not have. So don't expect any glittering social commentary. What I have to give to the conversation is philosophical distinctions, some tools to think with, mediated from one of the greatest thinkers in the history of Catholic moral thought. It's a small contribution, but hopefully not nothing. Why a Thomistic approach to racism? Aquinas himself didn't discuss racism, of course, and in fact, the concept of race itself comes rather late in history. It's first clearly articulated in 1684 in Spain. Nevertheless, there are two reasons why developing a Thomistic approach is valuable. First, Aquinas can offer some much needed tools to our current conversation on racism. In popular discourse, it is often hard to find a substantial explanation of what makes racism evil, other than a vague appeal to abstract principles of equality. Aquinas can help us fill that gap in two ways. First, his theory of evil offers a framework for carefully evaluating how different expressions of racism threaten the human good. And second, his understanding of the social dimension of human nature can explain not only what makes racism wrong, but also why I should care about it today. For Aquinas, as we will see, the moral evils involved in racism are not just failures to treat others equally, but more fundamentally, failures in the essential human vocation to love. In fact, Aquinas calls human nature the nature we ought to love. So a Thomistic approach to racism may turn out to be extraordinarily morally demanding. When are we ever done loving the nature we ought to love? The second reason is the reverse of the first, namely, exploring racism helps make Thomistic ethics more Thomistic. In teaching Thomistic ethics, our attention is often caught by the thing that really stands out in a relativistic culture, namely the emphasis on absolute moral prohibitions, and especially not killing the innocent. If you studied the principle of double effect, perhaps in connection with just war theory or abortion, you know that Thomistic ethics has developed enormously sophisticated reflection about the wrongness of killing the innocent, and that is wonderful. But it is hard to find the same level of sophistication in discussions of what we should do in the sense of our positive obligations toward others. And racism is an issue where we're forced to think carefully about our positive obligations. If I haven't personally enslaved anyone, but I live in a country where some racial groups disproportionately struggle to access human goods, what is that to me? Is it morally wrong not to do something? Thinking about racism forces us to pay more attention to such questions, which get at something ultimately more fundamental to Aquinas' ethics than the more often studied moral prohibitions. So tonight I want to consider, what can Aquinas tell us about what kind of evil racism is and what our moral responsibilities are in response to it? We'll proceed in 3 steps. Now, we can't talk about the moral evils of racism without a clear picture of what we mean by evil and what we mean by racism. So in the first part of the talk, I will briefly lay out Aquinas' theory of evil. And in the second part of the talk, I will identify 2 evils that are grouped together under the label of racism and explain where each falls within Aquinas' theory of evil. In the third part of the talk, using some basic ethical principles from Aquinas, I will describe our moral obligations in the face of those evils and briefly point to how we might start fulfilling those obligations today. So our starting point is the question, what is evil? For us, the word evil sounds very strong, like extreme wickedness. But Aquinas uses the term evil, in Latin malum, in its most general sense to refer to any defect in a thing that deprives it of what it ought to have for its perfection. Each thing naturally tends toward its perfection. And when it lacks that perfection, it suffers a defect, which is to say, an evil. For example, blindness is a defect, an evil, for an owl's eye, depriving the eye of the good of sight. Similarly, holes in the roof are an evil or a defect for my house. This is not my house. Preventing my house from doing a good job of sheltering. Evil is a deprivation of any good that perfects a thing's nature. And that's why even though rose bushes can't see, blindness isn't a defect or an evil for a rose bush because rose bushes aren't supposed to see. Now, as rational creatures, we humans have free will, and the actions of our will are liable to a special kind of defect, moral evil. Other creatures pursue their good by nature. So catching and eating a bird is good for the heron, and the heron doesn't choose what it's doing, it just acts from its nature unless prevented. But we humans have the unique privilege of pursuing our good freely by willing or choosing it. But we do not always will rightly, and in that case, our willing is defective. For instance, suppose I decide to steal a laptop left unattended in the library. In so willing, I am turning away from the human good of living together in cooperation, which requires respecting others' property. My willing to steal is a defective willing that pulls me away from God and others. In willing defectively, I fall short of living the human life well. And that defect is what Aquinas calls moral evil. Aquinas considers moral evil as the worst of all human defects. Terrible things can befall a human being. We suffer biological evils such as death, sickness, loss of bodily function, brain damage, cold, pain, hunger. We can suffer deprivation of clothes, shelter, money, food, clean water, education. We also suffer evils when we cannot exercise activities such as knowing and remembering, feeling joy, having close family relationships, or participating in meaningful work. Nonetheless, Aquinas points out all these are evils that happen to us, whereas moral evil alone is something that I bring forth from myself. In willing wrongly, I am actively bringing forth from myself something twisted and deficient. Consequently, Aquinas says, there is no evil more alien from God than a deficiency of willing or moral evil. So to recap, in Thomistic language, evil is any defect or deprivation. Moral evils are defects of human willing. And all other kinds of evils are what I'm going to call evils for a nature. So for instance, sickness is an evil for the nature of a human. Wobbliness is an evil for the nature of a chair leg. Section 2. Now we can ask, what kind of evil is racism? So let's start with a general definition. Aquinas defines justice as giving each person their due, while injustice consists in giving someone more or less than their due. Injustices can be done not only by private individuals toward one another, but also by the community towards its members, when the community distributes common goods to its members or punishes wrongdoers. Racism then will be a certain kind of injustice in which, as a result of belonging to some racial group, someone receives less good or more harm than he or she is due, either from a private individual or from the community. Now, Aquinas points out that justice has a certain outcome as its goal. The goal is for someone to receive what is owed her. Thus, an outcome can still be unjust, even if it was unintended, and Aquinas calls this a material injustice. Doing an injustice in the widest sense, therefore, consists in causing an undue outcome, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And thus, similarly, that was also unintentional. Thus, similarly, we will here define racism in the widest sense as causing unjust outcomes for members of a racial group. These unjust outcomes, as we will see, may be inflicted intentionally or unintentionally, and that will depend on how we categorize them then as types of evil. So there are lots of different kinds of racism, but for tonight, we can just pick out two to focus on. The first is what I am going to call race-hateful acts, namely actions that express the agent's ill will towards persons of another race. Such acts are all too familiar: enslaving someone, insulting them, beating them, paying them unjustly low wages, charging unjustly high prices, depriving of employment and promotion, depriving of various available goods, such as food, water, housing, education, civic participation, property ownership, healthcare, economic mobility, legal representation, safety, the opportunity to worship God freely, etc., etc., etc. Some of these descriptions might feel far away, but here's an example that strikes close to home for me personally. Recently, a very dear friend of mine from East Africa, let's call her Sarah, escaped her home country, where she had been subjected to horrifyingly brutal violence by her government, and fled to the United States seeking asylum. Upon arriving in the US, one interaction is burned in Sarah's memory. Upon hearing her account of how she had been brutalized in her home country, an officer shouted at her, "You Africans are all liars. I'm going to make sure you get deported." In fact, he had no such authority. He was simply terrorizing her. But you can imagine the psychological harm, the fear, humiliation, alienation that such a remark inflicted on someone who is already traumatized and completely helpless in a strange country. This is a race-hateful act because Sarah is singled out to receive undue harm specifically because she's African. Now, what are race-hateful acts within Aquinas' theory of evil? And the answer is relatively easy. Race-hateful acts are acts of intentionally inflicting harm. But Aquinas holds that any act of willing to inflict harm on another human being, is essentially a defect of willing. And since a defect of will is a moral evil, then willing to inflict harm on other humans is essentially morally evil. Now, here the value of Thomistic ethics can really shine through because we can follow up with Aquinas with the question, what exactly is wrong with willing harm to others? And Aquinas has an answer. To begin, willing harm to others, he says, is the same as hating them. And here it's important to understand that loving and hating for Aquinas are the two most basic tendencies of the will. When the will is attracted towards something, that is love. When it recoils or turns away from something, that is hate. So when I intend harm to someone, my will is recoiling from their good. And that's just to say I'm hating them. But Aquinas states that hating one's brother is always sinful. Why always sinful? And the reason I think here is very interesting. Aquinas considers hating another human being to be an unnatural act of will. That is, an act contrary to the very nature of the will itself. For Aquinas, the human will is naturally inclined toward loving what is human. That is why I first love myself and then extend that love to those who share my nature. And Aquinas even translates this natural tendency into a positive moral obligation. Humans have a nature we ought to love. So he says, quote, "When we consider a human being in himself, meaning as human, it is in no way permissible to kill him." This is in an explanation of what's wrong with killing. "For we ought to love the nature in each one, even in the sinner, a nature that God has made and that would be destroyed through killing." And what is fascinating about this passage is that Aquinas insists that the harming, the killing the innocent here, is wrong because it violates the more fundamental positive obligation to love each human being because of his or her nature. The reason that killing is wrong in the first place is that it is contrary to the love we owe this nature we ought to love. We'll come back to that later. So to summarize, loving human beings is a tendency of our nature, our human nature, and an obligation. Hating them is an act of will contrary to its nature and always morally wrong. So then why do we hate? Aquinas is a keen reader of human psychology, and he points out that hate arises from our perception of dissonance with the other person, meaning that we perceive the person as out of tune with us, lacking commonality, communitas, with us. In other words, in other words, I begin to hate you when I dehumanize you, putting you outside the human community or seeing you as not sharing, lacking that community with my nature. When I cease to see that you and I have a nature in common that ought to be loved. And this is an image from 1911 that dramatizes a kind of racial hierarchy that was very common at the time. So the message is clear. Within Thomistic ethics, within Thomistic ethics, race-hateful acts are essentially morally evil due to their origin in an unnatural act of setting one's will against the nature we ought to love. The second kind of racism that I want to analyze in Thomistic terms is trickier and needs a longer discussion. This is structural racism, namely a set of structures within society that in their regular functioning produce unjust outcomes that disproportionately burden members of some racial groups. As an example, let's consider the famous historical case of redlining, which resulted in the kinds of structures I'm describing. Some of you may be familiar with this. During the 1930s, the Federal Housing Administration developed mortgage financing programs to encourage home buying. Neighborhoods with mainly Black residents, however, were excluded from the program. They were literally marked in red or redlined. You can see them on the map. This is a map of Detroit. The rationale was that white homeowners didn't want Black neighbors, so the FDA rated mortgages for homes near Black neighbors as high risk. The consequences for Black home buyers and Black neighborhoods were dramatic. Homes in or near Black neighborhoods dropped in value. Their purchasers, typically Black Americans, were shut out of subsidies available to purchases in other neighborhoods. and Black Americans could not easily move out of redlined neighborhoods because the same dynamic was causing white neighborhoods to require buyers to sign covenants when they purchased a home, promising not to resell to non-white buyers to protect neighboring home values. And that was the case even in my own neighborhood in South Bend, which was built in the 1920s. It was built under covenants. This set of social structures had the effect of restricting Black home buyers to certain neighborhoods, devaluing the homes available for them to purchase, and reducing Black purchasing power and equity. Thus, the system for securing homeownership in those decades illustrates structural racism. Namely, in its function, the structures for the transfer of property deprived certain members of society of their due. Although these practices were outlawed in the late 1960s, the damage they did continues to reverberate today. In Chicago, according to a recent Forbes article, Black homeowners are nearly 5 times more likely to own in a formerly redlined neighborhood than in a green-lined neighborhood. Black homeownership rates are dramatically lower than other groups. Home values are on average lower, appreciating more slowly. Mortgage applications are more often rejected. Since home ownership has been an important means of growing wealth in America, these realities compounded over generations can affect everything from job opportunity to school quality. Today, Black Americans are disproportionately affected by hazards related to substandard housing, including lead poisoning, hazardous material, contaminated water, and death in home fires, as we may know from recent news. Thus, structural racism persists in the American housing system today because despite reforms, the functioning of the housing system continues to burden some members of society with more harm and less good than their due. Now, it might be helpful to emphasize here that structural racism doesn't need to originate in race-hateful choices. Here's an example. The medical device called a pulse oximeter estimates your blood oxygen levels by shining light through your finger. If you don't know what a pulse oximeter is, you've probably been living in a cave over the last 2 years. At 88%, your blood oxygen is considered dangerously low, requiring medical intervention. But the problem, skin pigment affects the light shining through, causing the device to overestimate blood oxygen levels in darker-skinned patients. Now, no one imagines that the inventors of the oximeter deliberately calibrated it to put darker-skinned patients at greater medical risk. But that's the effect. So this is an example of a set of medical practices and devices that, unless adjusted, carries structural racism. So in Aquinas' framework, what kind of evil is structural racism? Can we make sense of that within his metaphysics? In order to isolate the structural component, let us just assume that loan officers, real estate agents, nurses, etc., are not intending to deprive anyone of housing and healthcare. So if that's true, then structural racism is not a defect in a human will. Therefore, it's an evil for a nature. But what kind of nature? I would propose that within Aquinas' metaphysics, structural racism should be understood as an evil of a human artifact, and specifically of a social artifact. Now, the word artifact might make you think of an object, like a chair. But it is important to realize that there are also social artifacts. Cities, schools, laws, procedures, practices, and customs are all social artifacts that we humans are continuously building up generation after generation out of our creativity and rationality. For Aquinas, it belongs to human nature to construct such artifacts because we're social beings. We flourish only together in community. Thus, whereas modern political philosophers like Locke and Rousseau might think of social structures as ways we protect ourselves from others, Aquinas sees them as required for a good life together. Because of my social nature, I flourish only as part of a flourishing community. And a flourishing community needs structure. It must have rulers, education, a system of exchanging and securing goods, ways of providing safety, all organized through laws and customs. And this would be true, Aquinas says, even if there had been no original sin. These structures are the community's ways of distributing to its members common goods, such as honor, knowledge, wealth, property, safety, mobility, etc. And when these structures function well, distributing common goods to each member according to his or her due, the community is in a good condition. Indeed, the community's good condition, its flourishing, is what the common good is at the most general level. In a way, we could think of the distribution as the distribution of the flourishing of the community at the most general level, but then specified in these ways. So a defect or evil for a social structure then is a defect or evil for the community, holding the community back from attaining the good of its nature. So now I think we found the broad place where structural racism fits into Aquinas' theory of evil. It is an evil or defect in a social structure for distributing common goods, according to which the structure functions in such a way as to produce injustices in which some individuals get more than they are owed and some get less. More specifically, an unjust social structure is racist when the injustices it produces follow racial patterns. Those that get more than they should usually belong to some racial group or other, and those that get less than they should usually belong to others. Now, we should look more closely at an ambiguity in the concept of structural racism here. To get to the heart of the problem, it might be helpful to imagine somebody raising an objection. But Professor Corey, you might say, this Thomistic way of analyzing structural racism doesn't really help us with the controversial cases. Of course, everyone agrees that social structures are racist when they use race as a criterion for depriving someone of housing, like the American housing system under redlining in the 1930s. But when race isn't used as a criterion for distributing housing, and yet the outcomes are worse for one racial group over another, why should we talk of structural racism? Maybe there's some other cause that has nothing to do with race, or maybe the whole thing is just an accident. Now, Aquinas doesn't have a direct answer to this question, but we can piece together some useful thoughts as follows. To begin with, he says that the community must distribute common goods in accord with the proper cause that makes someone deserve such a good. That's how distribution maintains justice. For instance, Aquinas says knowledge is the proper cause for being promoted to professor. It would be unjust, he said, if someone were made a professor because he is Peter or Martin. And I kind of like this example because I wonder if he knew a Peter or Martin that he thought shouldn't have been a professor. Or because he is a rich or a relative. And similarly, we could say, applying to the present case, promoting someone to professor or restricting their housing options because of their racial identity would similarly be unjust. That's not a proper cause. But now suppose that a university selects professors according to knowledge, but it just so happens that the professors thus selected are nearly all named Martin. This should be puzzling because there is no essential connection between being named Martin and having knowledge. And it should be equally puzzling if knowledge turns out to be correlated in the choice of professors with skin color. There's also no essential connection between skin color and having knowledge. So why the pattern? Now, for Aquinas, regular patterns cannot emerge by chance. What happens by chance happens rarely or never. If something happens regularly, there has to be some cause of the regularity. So in the hypothetical medieval case, we should guess that even if being named Martin is not directly the cause of the promotion, there has to be some cause higher up in the chain of causes that regularly is functioning to link knowledge with being named Martin earlier in the process. So perhaps we might suppose that the local noblemen usually take the name Martin, and only children from noble families are allowed to pursue higher education in Paris in the 13th century. This is not true. Do not put this on a history exam. Similarly, I would suggest, if we notice racial patterns in the outcomes of a structure that is supposed to be distributing goods justly, those racial patterns cannot come from nowhere. For instance, when wondering how most professors end up being white, we may trace the cause in much earlier in the process of distributing education, in which schools in minority neighborhoods typically underperform relative to other schools and tend to be vastly underfunded relative to other schools. So now we have a cause farther back in the causal chain that's functioning in a regular way to link racial identity to education. So for determining the justice or injustice of the situation, then the question has to be, is that cause that's functioning to make the link regular, is that cause functioning justly or unjustly? And this is where all sorts of the debate becomes extremely heated, and 1,000 people will leap in with 1,000 reasons why this or that school is underperforming. But remember, as we saw from Aquinas, the community must distribute common goods in relation to the proper cause of deserving. And none of the 1,000 reasons that we might bring forward to explain why a school might be underperforming can be causes to justify why, when the community distributes the common good of education, children in these neighborhoods are owed less of it. Children across the community all have the same status or dignitas relative to deserving the good of education. So if the community distributes insufficient educational good to some children, then it does so unjustly, giving them less than their due. And if that injustice is correlated with race, then that's exactly what people mean when they're talking about structural racism. So in short, the point is that when a social structure produces patterns of racial disadvantage, these patterns signal that even if parts of the structure are well functioning on the surface, nonetheless, somewhere in the structure, there is some unjust distribution that causes the pattern downstream. At the end of the day, if the community is improperly distributing goods, it is not suitably fulfilling its nature. Regardless of whether the racist structure originally came into existence through race-hateful acts, or is currently being managed with race-hateful intent, or just became defective through a series of unfortunate catastrophes and bad management. Aquinas' theory of evil helps us to see that no matter how it originated or is currently managed, if a structure in itself is defective in its functioning, then the community is defective to the extent that it operates seeking its good through that structure. For the last section of the talk, I want to discuss a Thomistic account of our moral responsibilities regarding the two evils of racism that we discussed above. And we're going to set aside race-hateful acts because the earlier discussion already made clear what our responsibilities are. Don't perform such acts, since it is always wrong to will harm to our neighbor. So we don't need to discuss that more. Instead, I will focus on our moral obligations toward the second kind of evil, structural racism, which are not so readily obvious. So as we saw, structural racism is, in Thomistic terms, an evil for a nature, the nature of a social structure that produces injustices, harms to my neighbors. The fundamental question that we have before us more broadly is this: when my neighbor is being harmed, do I have any moral obligations to step in? Now, this is a very challenging question for us culturally, because we tend to assume that positively doing good goes above and beyond our moral obligation. So I know I should certainly not insult a homeless person as I pass him on the street, but am I morally required to buy him a sandwich? Most of us would say no. If we did buy him a sandwich, we would likely feel that we had gone above and beyond what is morally required. This is the spirit behind Judith Jarvis Thomson's 1971 A Defense of Abortion, which distinguishes between what someone has the right to demand of you and what is nice of you to do. Criticizing the parable of the Good Samaritan, she objects that you are under no obligation to help someone unless you have personally agreed to do so. If you could cure a fever by stepping across a room, she says it is arguably indecent to refuse, but still, you're not morally obliged to help. This sort of thinking, I suspect, explains why discussions of structural racism immediately unleash heated accusations and counter-accusations about who is to blame for the situation. It is as though both sides assume that I cannot be morally obliged to remedy a racial injustice unless I am in some way personally guilty of inflicting that injustice. This is precisely where Thomistic ethics can help us, because Aquinas occupies a totally different moral universe. Remember that he calls human nature the nature we ought to love. Quote, let's return to that text. When we consider a human being insofar as he is human, it is in no way permissible to kill him, for we ought to love the nature in each one, even in the sinner, a nature that God has made and that would be destroyed through killing. Ought to love. Ought. The prohibition on harming is more fundamentally rooted in the commandment to love. It is wrong to harm precisely because we are commanded to love, and harming is incompatible with loving. Thus, Aquinas explains that what is morally owed is twofold. First, we are morally obligated to meet the minimum threshold without which there can be no virtue at all, and his examples are avoiding evil such as killing or stealing. And second, we are morally obligated toward what helps us grow more perfect in virtue. And his example here is the Old Testament requirement that when a debtor gives you his coat to repay a loan, you must return it before sunset in case he might have to sleep in the cold. Therefore, do not kill, do not enslave, do not hate. These moral prohibitions are a minimum first step on the path toward fulfilling our obligation, which is expressed in the commandment to love the nature that ought to be loved. Thus, Aquinas further insists, quote, every law aims at the establishment of friendship, either the friendship of one human with another or of humans with God. And thus the whole law is fulfilled in this one commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, which is, as it were, the goal, the end of all commandments. And this commandment, he adds, is the same as do unto others as you would have others do unto you. My parents used to say, don't do that to your little sister if you don't want her to do it to you. But Aquinas puts it the other way around. You shall love, do unto others. And even Thompson notices that Jesus does not say it would be nice of us to follow the example of the Good Samaritan, who, don't forget, stopped to help a total stranger that someone else beat up and robbed. Rather, Jesus commands us, go and do likewise. Thompson just doesn't buy that we're morally obliged to act like this and thinks most people in America wouldn't buy it either. But Aquinas is someone who buys it. So for Aquinas, all the fighting about who's really responsible for low home ownership rates, bad schools, whether I'm off the hook because my great-grandparents never owned slaves, or if I'm on the hook because my parents' home gained in value when others' homes did not, none of that has to be settled in order to answer the question of whether I am obligated to do something now. While getting the history right and identifying guilt is important, there's a sense in which it doesn't change our moral obligation. If my neighbor's house is burning down, we can stand there and debate whether it was a wildfire or the Klan or a drunken cigarette, but none of this changes the fact that my neighbor is homeless and I am passing by, and I am subject to the basic commandment written into human nature itself to love the nature that ought to be loved. That command obliges me to love and do good to my neighbor. In failing to do so, I'm guilty of an omission, which Aquinas calls the special sin of, quote, failing to complete a good that is owed. In other words, the sin of doing nothing where I should have done something. So that is a quick Thomistic sketch of our positive obligation to love and do good to our neighbor. And let's apply it now to structural racism. The commandment to love requires us, I would argue, to address structural racism for two reasons. First, for the sake of the neighbors who are suffering an injustice, and second, for the sake of the community, which is failing in its fundamental function of distributing common goods. Let me explain. First of all, if I love my neighbor as myself, I should be moved by seeing injustice done to them, and I should want to remedy the situation. For Aquinas, the virtue of mercy makes us responsive to the harm being suffered to our neighbor. And he calls mercy the greatest of all the virtues having to do with our neighbor. If I have the opportunity and capacity to help diminish the harm, if I'm in the position of passing by, as in the parable of the Good Samaritan, then the commandment to love obliges me to do what I can. Secondly, structural racism is additionally morally urgent because this defect strikes at the very heart of what a community is and should be. According to Aquinas, the community is the whole of which we are all parts, and the part ought to love the whole more than itself. Thus, he says, we ought especially to love the community and desire its good. Evils afflicting the community are even more urgent than evils afflicting private individuals. And that is why Aquinas says that it's natural for a citizen to even risk his life for the good of the community. The communal nature of this particular evil, therefore, makes it especially morally urgent to address. But also, for the same reason, it is especially difficult to address. In America, for example, our communal structure for distributing the good of shelter involves the banking industry, the 9th largest industry in the US, the real estate market, an absolute massive heap of federal and state laws, municipal zoning laws, the Federal Housing Administration, physical infrastructures of cities, FEMA, nonprofits, homeless shelters, armies of social workers, professional associations, each one having its own guidelines, local regulations, etc., etc., etc. What am I, one small person, morally obliged to do to improve something so absolutely massive? Aquinas can help us here one last time. As he emphasizes, there can be no moral obligation to do the impossible. What I am obliged to do is the good I owe, bonum debitum. And what good do I owe? According to Aquinas, our moral responsibilities come on two settings. On one setting, I have certain moral obligations to the extent to which I have care of the community. Community structures are like gardens. They must constantly be tended by individual caretakers. So if I have care of the community at any level, then I'm morally responsible for how goods are distributed under my care. So as a professor, if I know that my teaching methods don't distribute knowledge and grades justly to my students, and I don't bother to change anything about them, I am wronging the little corner of the community that is in my care. Similarly, bank managers, loan officers, real estate investors, policy writers, CEOs of banks, the head of the FHA, politicians, all of them have in some way care of some part of the community at some level that is involved in distributing shelter. And I think what Aquinas would ask of each of us is to look for the things that we're responsible for under the care of as members of the community that have care of some part of the community, because we have a moral obligation to do what is possible to make that part of the system under our care more just. On another setting, though, as we saw, I have moral responsibilities just as a member of society. Even if I do not have care of a structure that produces racial injustices, I should still earnestly desire its improvement and advocate to those who actually do have care of it, urging them to distribute with greater justice. Anyway, I don't have to wait to change an entire structure in order to love the nature I ought to love. And on that point, I want to leave you with an image. You may remember a couple of months back when the Belarusian government had collected thousands of Iraqi migrants and trapped them at the Polish border, carefully timed to coincide with the onset of winter, creating a huge international standoff with the Polish government and the European Union. There was an article about some residents of the border area in Poland who were providing food, shelter, medical aid, and warm clothing to migrants who did make it across the border. And the journalist had interviewed a guy named Roman, quote, a local resident who said he was moved to act after hearing that migrants had been dying in the freezing conditions in the forest. Here's what Roman said about why he was helping. Quote, I told myself, I cannot solve the bigger problem, he said. I leave it to the United Nations, NATO, and the government. But no one will die in my forest. I was really struck by that remark. No one will die in my forest. I think sometimes when we're trying to love our neighbor, we encounter problems that are so overwhelming that we try to protect ourselves by arguing that there isn't a problem, or that if there is a problem, we have no obligation to address it. Or maybe we even try to find a reason why the people suffering deserve to suffer. But within the framework of Thomistic ethics, what actually matters is that my neighbor has a nature I ought to love. And that nature calls out to me right now, right here where I am passing by. No one will be humiliated by racial mockery in my office. No minority applicants will be disadvantaged by my company's hiring policies. No immigrant family will have to live in unsafe housing in my community. No one will die in my forest. Activists often say you don't have to do everything, you just have to do something. And Thomistic ethics gives us a deep explanation for why that's true. Loving the nature we ought to love is not a task we can check off our moral checklist and be done with for a while. We're never done with it for the same reason that we're never done with being human. It's a vocation to which we are each called. It's the properly human way of life. Thank you.
We do have some time for Q&A, maybe 15, 20 minutes or so. There will be a